Can he tell us how many are on? Thank you for joining us. We are in the nave of the Church of the Holy Spirit in Lake Forest, Illinois, and we are beginning our Faith at Work program for today. Each month since 2008, that's 16 years, we have listened to the faith stories of over 130 guests. Each one has their unique story, and they help us to explore the connection between our worship and faith in the workaday world. Leaders in their careers and communities in Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish faiths have shared their story. Today will be no exception. We welcome Frank Jimenez, and I'd like to begin with a prayer.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we give you thanks for Frank's presence here today, for so many years of faith at work in our community, and for the ways that he contributes to this community and to our world now. Oh God, you have taught us that as we abide open to one another, you dwell in us. Help us to preserve openness of heart. Help us to realize that there can be no understanding where there is mutual rejection. Help us in accepting one another wholeheartedly as we are accepted by you. We are gifted with many possibilities because our being is in your being, our spirit in your spirit. May we be bound together and united in one spirit, taking many forms, to enable your divine love to become known in our troubled world. In the name of the Lord and lover of our lives, Christ Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Wow. It's always a pleasure to gather and hear the stories, but I'm particularly excited about your story, Frank. Frank speaks of his career as a journey, both surprising and unpredictable. He graduated from the University of Miami and then Yale Law School. He entered into private practice with a Miami law firm, but, as he says, you can never be sure where your career might head. And for Frank, that meant several stints in the government service, including the U.S. Department of Defense, as the Principal General Counsel of the Navy, Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and General Counsel for Florida under the governorship of Governor Jeb Bush. Ensuring a broad base of academic heft, he added an MBA in Finance and Strategic Planning. I don't know how you got all of this in. From Penn's Wharton School, and a Master of Arts in National Security and Strategic Studies from the U.S. Naval War College, with an emphasis on the law of armed conflict. With administration changes in D.C., Frank was recruited to Raytheon Technologies in Boston as their EVP and General Counsel, and managing over 600 attorneys. Today, Frank is the Group VP and General Counsel for GE Healthcare. We're really glad they recruited you to Chicago.
I am too.
And that's quite a breadth of experience, and certainly private practice all the way through government to corporate leadership. But most importantly, and I know she's out there, he's the father of two beautiful little girls and the husband of Debbie. So let's explore your beginnings, Frank, your early life, your family, your friends, your school.
So I'm a child of immigrants. I'm the only one in my family who's not an immigrant. My parents and older brother Mark were born in Cuba and left in 1961 when my brother was just a year and a half old. And they left for Puerto Rico, where I was born, And when I was 3, we moved to Miami, where I grew up. My dad's passed, but my mom is 87, and she lives in the same house that my parents bought 57 years ago when I was 3 years old. So when I go home to visit my mom, it's my childhood home. She'll be 88 in August. And my parents met singing in a church choir. When people meet me and learn a little bit about my background, that I'm Cuban American, they assume that I grew up in a Catholic tradition. Actually, Southern Baptist. Back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there were as many as 100,000 Southern Baptists in Cuba, thanks to American missionaries. I can name off the top of my head the 2 missionaries from Georgia that were instrumental in founding the church where my parents met, Herbert and Marjorie Cowdell. Never met them in my life, and they're now in heaven. But they played an integral role in my parents coming to faith and meeting one another in the church choir in this Southern Baptist church in Havana, where they got married in 1957, and then had my brother in 1959. So that's a little bit about my background.
So it must have been some incident, some concern that forced them to leave Cuba. It must not have been easy.
Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
Now, some people have this picture of Cubans fleeing Castro because they lost land and money, professionals, etc. That wasn't the case for most Cubans who left Cuba because of communism. My parents never went to college. My dad never even attended high school. When they came here to the U.S., they couldn't speak English. They had no money. They left with 2 suitcases filled with clothes and $500 that a benefactor had given them. That was it. So they weren't robbed of privilege. They were robbed of freedom. And they came here to make sure that their son and any future children that they had would be able to live in freedom and not under tyranny.
How did that translate in terms of your education then as you got to Miami?
So my dad worked 2 jobs. He was a self-taught graphic arts designer in the days way before computers. So rulers and papers, and I did not inherit his artistic abilities. But he worked during the day for a company that manufactured signs and billboards. And then he would come home and watch with us Hogan's Heroes or something on TV. And then he'd go into his home office where he was a freelance designer, graphic arts designer, taking on freelance projects. And he would work until 1, 2, 3 in the morning, go to bed for a few hours, wake up, and do it all over again. And my mom was largely a homemaker, but she also assisted my dad in his freelance work at home. And they were able to scrap together a pretty good living, certainly much better than they would have had in Cuba. And they sent my brother and I to a local private school, Miami Christian School, where I attended from 4th grade all the way through 12th grade. Years later, I returned as a member of the board of directors of that school. And to this day, it's part of our giving. So that's a school that played an instrumental role in my life and in my brother's life as well. But my parents worked hard to send us to that school.
Yeah. What was your faith journey during that time?
So I grew up in a Spanish-speaking Baptist church, and although Spanish was my first language, unlike my brother, I never attended school where the classes were taught in Spanish. From pre-kindergarten on, I attended English schools. And so English very quickly became my dominant language. And I speak Spanish today, but not nearly as well as I speak English. And during those early years of elementary school, as I attended church in Spanish with my parents, I found it hard to follow the sermons. Really wasn't engaged in the life of the church. A lot of the vocabulary I didn't understand because it was scriptural, not, plain Spanish. And so I kind of detached from the life of the church, and I would sit in the back and read a book during the church service. Meanwhile, from 4th grade on, when I started attending Miami Christian, faith for me came alive there at school, not at church. And my 4th grade teacher, Barbara Molman, led me to Christ. And I remember very vividly the day in which one afternoon after school was over, I sat with her and talked through the experience of receiving Jesus personally, through a lot of tears. Fast forward, this is a side story. Fast forward a few decades, a friend of mine from school, I'm now in my 30s, asked me to sing at her grandmother's funeral. I grew up singing in the Miami boy choir. My life peaked at an early age when I literally sang with Luciano Pavarotti in the Miami Opera Association's production of La Boheme.
Oh.
And
you didn't tell me about this.
Yeah, no, it's long ago, half a century ago. And then my voice changed, and it all went downhill from there. But I did grow up singing publicly and have sung in over 20 weddings and funerals. And so my friend asked me to sing at her grandmother's funeral. And when she gave me the song to sing, I thought to myself, I didn't tell my friend this, but I thought to myself, this is a very cheesy song. It's a Ray Boltz song, Thank You for Giving to the Lord. It's about all these people that you meet in heaven who have, been instrumental in your life on earth. But I thought it was a little corny. It's like, okay, I'll sing this. I'm thinking this to myself. I'm not telling this to my friend. So the day before the funeral, she drops off the program for the funeral in my mailbox, and I go and get it, and I read her grandmother's biography, and was stunned to discover and to remember that her grandmother was the mother of my 4th grade teacher.
Oh, my word.
Who led me to Christ. And so all of a sudden, I went from thinking, how can I sing this song without laughing, to how can I sing this song without crying?
Yeah.
And anyways, Barbara Molman, my 4th grade teacher, was very important in the beginning of my faith journey. So then I said I needed to get baptized, so I went to the Spanish Baptist Church, and I sat in the back, and I read my book during the service like I always did, and then when the service was over, I went up front and said, I want to get baptized. And so I was baptized in that church. A couple of years later, friends from school invited me to attend an English-speaking church, University Baptist Church in Coral Gables, a suburb of Miami. And I attended once with them, and then I attended a second time and joined without asking my parents for permission. So I came home that day and told my parents that I'd joined another church. This is the 6th grader just, on his own, leaving his family church. But within 2 years, the whole rest of the family had migrated over to that church. And that's the church that was most instrumental in my faith journey. And in later years, served as chairman of deacons. And if I still lived in Miami, that's the church I would be attending today.
You were a leader right from the beginning, and a little bit challenging probably to your mom and dad, too. You mentioned to me that 8 or 9 times in your career you thought you were going to do one thing and then you did another. And so, thinking about how you graduated from high school and went off to college, and your father, I think, thought you should be a doctor. And how did that work out?
So I talk about this quite a bit. People read my bio and focus on the things that went right. Mm-hmm. But my career has been defined just as much by the things that went wrong or that seemed to have gone wrong at the time. I grew up telling my parents I wanted to be an ophthalmologist. I don't know what TV show I saw or what book I read that gave me that idea, but that was the seed that was planted in my mind, and then that was what I told my parents I would do, that's what I told my friends I would do, and so I was pre-med in college. At a high school, I applied for a 6-year program where you're admitted into college and med school at the same time, and so had I gotten into that program, I would have been locked into med school right out of high school, and I didn't get in. Later, when I changed my mind, and it took me 5 years to change my mind about not going to med school, that's a whole other story. But when I applied to law school, I didn't get into the law school I wanted to go to. I didn't know it at the time, but the law school I ended up going to was far better for me than my first choice would have been. Let's see, what happens next? So I worked at a law firm in private practice in Miami at the beginning of my career. That was most of the 90s. And then through a fluke, early in that time at the firm, as a young associate, I ended up working on the 1994 Jeb Bush for Governor campaign. This is his first race that he lost. There was a Bush family tradition of losing your first race. His father had done it, his brother did it, and Jeb did it. He lost his first race in 1994. He lost to the incumbent governor, Lawton Chiles, in a very close race. It was decided by 1.5 percentage points. And at the time, in 1994, that was the closest race, statewide race in Florida history. 6 years later, there was a race that was a little closer than that, the 2000 Florida recount. I was actually Governor Bush's general counsel at that time, so when the recount hit, my life as well as others for those 37 days were just turned upside down. But at any rate, when Jeb lost his first race, I returned to my law firm, worked for another 4 years, made partner. When Jeb ran again and won in 1998, he asked me to serve in his transition team, and then that led to a position working for him. And so my career had been going, despite the whole pre-med, med school detour, or near detour, my career had been going great. Law firm partner, working for the governor, his general counsel, his deputy chief of staff. And then his brother gets elected in 2000, and a couple years later, I am asked to serve as chief of staff to a cabinet secretary. So off to Washington I go. A year and a half later, the secretary informs the world that he's leaving to run for the U.S. Senate. So I had moved to Washington and taken this job, and my boss was leaving me. And chief of staff positions are tied very closely to the principal, so it put my job in jeopardy. And but I thought God was providing an alternative path. It looked like a position was open at the White House, and I was the leading contender to take that position. As it turns out, although everyone thought I was going to get the position, due to some political maneuverings and basically some backstabbing, I wasn't offered the job. And my career was in limbo. And I went through a 3 or 4 month period not knowing what was going to happen to my career. And I was 39. And it was the first time in my professional career where I had gone through a period of suffering and uncertainty and difficulty and trial. And I was in the middle of my MBA program, and I thought, well, I interviewed with a couple of investment banks on Wall Street, thinking I'd leave the administration. As it turns out, I ended up taking a job at the Pentagon, which was not nearly as glamorous, not nearly as high profile, and it seemed like a big step back in my career. If I hadn't taken that job, though, the rest of my career would have been very different and almost certainly not as successful, because that led to my later becoming General Counsel of the Navy, and that led to my becoming a Fortune 500 General Counsel. When I first got to the Pentagon, though, after a year, it looked like a high-profile position at the Department of Justice would be offered to me. The Attorney General had picked me to run one of the divisions of the Department of Justice. And it got all the way to the White House counsel, who's the last step before the president makes a nomination. And the same issues that had prevented me from joining the White House a year earlier, the same political maneuverings, came back to bite me a year later. But again, if I had gone to run the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, chances are that I would have been in for a lot of career turbulence there. Instead, a year later, the president nominates me to be General Counsel of the Navy, which was a wonderful job and a great honor to serve in that position. And it's some of the best memories of my career from those years as General Counsel of the Navy. And as I said, it led to future successes. But in 2008, when Barack Obama was running against John McCain, I knew that whoever won, that they would pick their own, in all likelihood, pick their own General Counsel of the Navy. And so I started figuring out what I was going to do next. And at the time, 4 positions were coming open on the 7-justice Florida Supreme Court. And 4 members of the 9-member Judicial Nominating Commission were friends of mine. And everyone encouraged me to apply, and the governor at the time, Charlie Crist, who had succeeded Jeb Bush, was a friend. And so it looked like Venus, Mars, and Jupiter were all aligning for me to take a seat on the Florida Supreme Court. And in fact, I applied, and one of the times was nominated along with others. But to make a long story short, that whole journey turned into a political ping pong match, and I was the ping pong ball being hit back and forth between people who loved Jeb Bush and people who didn't love Jeb Bush. And at the same time, Marco Rubio, who's running against Charlie Crist for the Senate, is pushing him further and further left. So by the time I got nominated, Governor Crist ends up picking someone else. So that felt like a huge setback for me. And it was done in a very public manner with newspaper editorials, and I was mentioned in a Wall Street Journal editorial, and it was a bit excruciating. I am so glad sitting here today that I didn't spend the last 15 years of my life in Tallahassee serving on the court. It's honorable work, but my career has taken me in directions that, for me, are much more enjoyable, fulfilling, rewarding, and so I'm very glad that didn't happen. And then the first corporate general counsel job that was offered to me ended up getting pulled back in a very unethical way, but then a better job offer came along. And I could go on and on. There's literally been 9 or 10 times in my career where I wanted something or applied for something and didn't get it, sometimes in very painful ways. And it turns out that what ended up happening instead was superior. And there's a couple of ways of looking at this. I believe both of them to be true. One way is that, God is in control. God was providing for me. God was opening and closing doors. And despite my efforts to the contrary, my, failed and flawed and sinful efforts, God was paving a better way for me. I believe that to be true. But another thing is that I think God was teaching me not to make an idol of my career. Because of dynamics for me growing up, I always sought to overachieve. And I sought success and significance and security and self-worth in my achievements. And basically, I was taking things that are good jobs, achievements, good schools, and putting them in the position of God. And that's basically idolatry.
Right.
And there's a reason why it's the first commandment. All other sins flow from that. But jobs can be taken from you, as they have been from me. Your money can be taken from you, but God can't. And I think during all those episodes, God was teaching me to order my loves, to order my priorities.
Wow, would that we all can sort of step back and think that way, but sometimes it takes the suffering and the challenges to really come face to face with that. It obviously helped your faith to grow and put you in places where I think about your involvement at the Department of Navy and then going to Raytheon, where you had, very important government contracts and accountability there. One of the Law Journal, the Yale Law Journal, interviewed you, and they spoke about the fact that not only was your journey surprising and unpredictable, but it taught you the importance of adaptability, versatility, and humility. I think you've sort of shown us how that is actually played out in your career. I'm just curious, can you say a little bit more about, within the context, you mentioned, some unethical situations that you faced, as well as the challenges of political maneuvering. How do you handle an ethical dilemma like that? Do you challenge it? Do you come face forward with it? What can you do when you're sort of almost in a helpless public forum like that?
Well, it goes back to what I just said, ordering your loves and ordering your priorities. What's most important? And is it the career success, or is it the God you love and serve? Is it the next rung on the ladder, or is it honesty, integrity, character, living out the values that one's, in my case, one's faith teaches should infuse everything you do. It's been over 20 years. I think the statute of limitations has expired, so I can talk about this. One of the questions you'd posed to me earlier is, did I ever face an ethical dilemma in my career? Thankfully, not many. I have served, by and large, great people, worked for great bosses, worked in great organizations, and have never been asked, at least not directly, to do something that I consider to be unethical. There was one time, though, where I faced an ethical dilemma, and it was during that period of career limbo I was talking about, when I thought I was going to go work at the White House, and instead I ended up with seemingly nothing. And the cabinet secretary I was working for, as I mentioned earlier, was leaving to run for the Senate, but in his time as Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, his number one priority was to reform the closing process on real estate transactions for consumers, to make the HUD closing statement simpler, more rational, and more transparent. because many of the costs that homeowners face are the nickels and dimes of all the different services that get tacked on, sometimes at the very end. And so reforming the process was his number one priority, and the department had worked on issuing a rule. The rule hadn't yet issued by the time the secretary chose to leave the department, and the president had announced that the deputy secretary was going to take his place. But the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, who had a conflict of interest because he, in his personal life, owned one of these title companies that stood to suffer from the new rule, basically dangled the confirmation process over the head of the deputy secretary. And here I am, the chief of staff, I'm losing my principal. The deputy secretary is inside the department is fighting issuing this rule. The White House, which had just held a conference on minority home ownership lauding this rule, wanted it to pass. And so I had to decide, as the secretary was leaving, whether to push the rule out or succumb to the deputy secretary and the head of legislative affairs who were fighting against it. And I pushed to get the rule out because it was what the secretary said was his number one priority. It's what the White House wanted. And to do otherwise was not the right and honorable thing to do. And that hurt me. Mm-hmm. But I'm glad I chose to do what I do. But when I think about ethical dilemmas, really that's the one that stands out the most.
Wow. One of the things that you've mentioned to me are the spiritual support that you had when you were in Washington. And I think that kind of, I'd love to have you explain that further, but I was very impressed that in the midst of all this public sphere, there was a God-based support group that you could go to. Why don't you share a little more of that?
So, I'm a pretty social person. The church youth group I grew up in was a loving and dynamic group. To this day, 40 years later, we're all in a group text. In college, one of the reasons I didn't go to med school is because I was much more interested in student government and student activities and things like that than in my classes. And in Washington, in Tallahassee and in Washington, my colleagues in both administrations ended up being, close personal friends. And so there was a connection inside of work and a connection outside of work. But for me, those 7 years in DC from 2002 to 2009 was really a wonderful period of close connections with friends working in many different parts of the administration and some not even working in the administration. But, a men's support group of 6 guys who would meet regularly. Mm-hmm. A book club based on, spiritual and Christian themes, attended by, 7 couples. Another close group of 3 guys that where we would meet regularly. And when I look back on my days in Washington, I think of that dynamic in those communities and networks as much as I think about my work at HUD or at the Pentagon.
Oh, wow. Well, I know that my husband is part of a small group of men who get together on a regular basis to read Christian-based literature, and it feels like that is such an important thing to do, even outside of church, to have that kind of context of support and dynamic to be able to speak openly with one another. Let's see how your time in Washington then informed your shift to the corporate world, and how different that must have been to be in a position of management where you could really be more direct in how you were calling the shots and setting the tones and managing people. How was that shift for you?
Not as jarring and dramatic as it might have been for others for a couple of reasons. One, both in the public sector and then later in the private sector, I was directly supporting chief executives of multi-billion-dollar enterprises. And there are certain skills that translate across sectors, across industries, for people in those positions. Teamwork, interpersonal skills, judgments, communication skills, management skills. And so there are more similarities as I think about that journey between the different jobs than there are differences. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, I got an MBA along the way. I started it when I was at HUD and I finished it when I was at the Pentagon. And so a few years later, when I moved into the corporate world, the concepts and the vocabulary were familiar to me because of that training. And then third, when I left the Pentagon, my first job was General Counsel of ITT in Westchester County, New York, and it was a multi-industrial company, but its largest business was defense technology. So even though I went from the public sector to the private sector, I was going from the Pentagon to a company that had as its principal focus supporting the fighting men and women of our armed forces. And so it wasn't as dramatic a change for me in going from public to private as it would have been otherwise had I gone to work for, say, GE Healthcare.
One of the things that I was interested in is how you were able to bring some of your values to the corporate world in almost a structured way. I mean, how you were able to talk about accountability and responsibility within a job, compliance issues, things like that. Did you, obviously that's something that government was also expecting of their contracts and relationships with corporations. But how did you see the way in which you could now be in charge of putting together some values and approaches to your corporate positions?
So, it flows, for me, it flows from, who you are as a person and why you do what you do. Some people think of work as the thing they have to do to make money to support their real lives, all right? Their lives outside of work, their lives of leisure, their family, etc. So there's this dualistic contrast between work and non-work. But if you think of work as an act of worship to the God who called and equipped you for that work, it's a much more integrated view of work and faith. And, the other day I was reading a Facebook post from an acquaintance of mine. We went to the same law school, but not at the same time, so we didn't overlap. He's a Jewish lawyer and rabbi, and he lost his home in the Palisades fire. And he talked in this post about his great-grandmother, who in 1899, in coming to the United States, brought with her 2 silver Shabbat candles that they would light every Friday night for Shabbat. And those candles were handed down to her oldest daughter, who handed them down to her oldest daughter, who handed them down to my friend Jonathan, her younger son. He joked and said that his older brother got the massive record collection. He got the 2 Shabbat candles. But for years, he would light the Shabbat candles every Friday night and gather his family around for prayer. When the Palisades fire happened and they had to flee their home, he said, the lawyer in me remembered to take the documents. The rabbi in me forgot to take the candles. So a few weeks later, he learned about this organization, Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's organization. And they have individuals who specialize in helping retrieve artifacts from burned homes. So he put himself in the queue to get their help, and they showed up one day at the site, his former home, to help him search for the candles. And here's someone whose personal politics are likely quite different from those Samaritan's Purse helpers who were there to help him find the Shabbat candles. And they describe the organization as Billy Graham's organization, not Franklin Graham's organization. It was probably a wise thing in talking to my friend. My friend admirably said that he resisted the temptation to talk about what he thought about Franklin Graham's politics and engage in a conversation with them about the Bible. And he said, I found them to be wonderful, delightful people. And it was a wonderful experience. And I told them that the candles were probably still in the dining room, and this is where the dining room used to be. And so they searched, and they found the candles.
Oh, my word. Wow.
And my friend said to them, you did it. And one of the Samaritan's Purse helpers said, no, God did it, but he has no hands but ours. And so if you think of work in that way, Jesus modeled a prayer for us. Part of it is, give us this day our daily bread. Does God descend, materialize once again in human form and hand us a bread loaf? No, he doesn't. But a farmer in Brazil grows wheat, which is shipped using trucks built by a company to a grain processing facility operated by another company, which is then processed and shipped to the United States and sold to a grocery store or to a baker. And the baker then takes the wheat and makes the loaf and either sells it directly or sells it to the grocery store. The people at the grocery store stock it, sell it, run the cash register, and maybe there's a delivery person who brings it to your doorstep. And so all these human hands are the vehicle through which God answers our prayer, give us this day our daily bread. We are the hands through which God orders and runs the world. And that's true for all of us. And, Paul talks about, working to where you're called. And he's not talking to the ministers of that church who are called. He's talking to every church member. And God calls us to what we do. And if we think of our work in that way, that we are literally the hands and feet and arms and bodies through which God orders and runs the world, it infuses our work with meaning. And if you approach work that way, it's a lot easier to run an ethical company or to manage people in an honorable and ethical way. Now, having said all that, most days I don't think of my job that way. Most days I think, oh, this is horrible, or I can't believe I have this problem, or, why do I have to work? And, I'm setting up this ideal to which we should all strive. I'm not saying that I live that every day. But it's always there in the back of my mind. And some days are better than others, and some days I actually, get closer to living that ideal than others. But without that foundation, I think it's very hard, or it would be much harder to bring ethics to the workplace.
Well, you not only bring ethics to the workplace, you also bring it outside of the workplace to a lot of volunteer activities that you have been involved with. And I'm most impressed with the work that you've done. You mentioned you were a deacon and very involved with your Christian school, but you really brightened up when you talked about the Equal Justice Works and the involvement that you have there, the mentorship, the building of opportunities and outreach to people that wouldn't necessarily have that kind of support.
Equal Justice Works is a great organization. It's a nonprofit, been around for 40 years, and it's the nation's largest public interest law organization. And basically, it sponsors hundreds each year, and over the course of its 40 years, thousands of fellows, which are generally young law graduates who go off for 2 years and work in all kinds of areas of social justice and social need. Mm-hmm. And whether it's veterans or the homeless or disaster relief victims or you name it, there's not an area of human need where Equal Justice Works doesn't somehow have some role to play. And it's a wonderful organization, and I'm honored now to be chairing the board of directors. You know, when we talked earlier, Mimi, one of the questions you asked me caused me to think about, how often do I talk about faith at work? Mm-hmm. And the answer is, I don't really wear it on my sleeve. Mm-hmm. There are times when it feels natural to say something, and at those times I will say something. One of those times recently, I went and toured the offices in the DC headquarters of Equal Justice Works and met a lot of the staff members, and afterwards we all gathered, and one of them asked me, why are you on the board? Why do you do what you do? And I said, my faith teaches me that what I do unto the least of these, I'm actually doing, for Jesus. And this is a way in which I can do that, because the least of these, the sick, the poor, those without clothes, the stranger, those in prison, those in need, this organization is meeting those needs. So I see it as an extension of my faith. That may have been the first time in a few years that I mentioned faith in connection with my Equal Justice Works service. I don't pop into board meetings and say, I'm a Christian and I'm, but when asked, it felt natural. When asked directly, it felt natural for me to say it. Mm-hmm. But that's why I'm, very happy to be working with an organization like that.
Well, you married later and became the father at age 48. And I would argue that we could all have used the experience and wisdom of 48 years before we had our children. However, I am reminded of a parent visiting day at the day school when you sat on the floor. I mean, all of us imagine getting down and took these sticks in your hand and were doing rhythm sticks with your little ones. And I thought, if there's anything more humbling than that, I don't know what it is. But you're on the board now of the Lake Forest Country Day School. You're also serving on the board of Lurie Children's Hospital. And I'm just grateful that not only are you taking your faith into your workplace, certainly into your home place. You can speak more of that if you'd like. But you've also brought it into our community, and we're enormously grateful for that.
Well, we're more than grateful and just beside ourselves in joy to find ourselves here. We were in Boston for 7 years before moving here 3 years ago. And we were happy in Boston. We had friends there, and Boston's a, fine city. We've made 10 times the number of friends here in half the time than we did in Boston. And I found ourselves being absorbed into the life of the community and its various organizations in a way that we just didn't find in Boston. So, my Raytheon went through the largest merger in the history of aerospace and defense when it merged with United Technologies back in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. I thought I had survived what was billed as a merger of equals, and I did serve as general counsel of the company for another year and a half. But it took about a year and a half for the legacy Raytheon people to realize this was not a merger of equals, which was a painful process. But if not for that, we wouldn't be here. And I am telling you, we are so much happier here in every facet of our lives than we were before. So that's yet another one of those times where not being in control and letting God dictate engineer the circumstances of our lives is a much happier thing to experience than ourselves trying to force things to happen. So one small correction: I married at 48.
Oh.
And became a father for the first time at 50.
Even more experience.
So, the dynamics I referred to earlier about looking for meaning and self-worth and dignity and security through achievements, that was a multi-decade process of growing beyond that, and first of all learning that about myself, and then making the necessary changes. Had I married when I still needed a lot of work to do in my own life, chances are the marriage would not have been a happy one. So I'm grateful to God that He gave me the wisdom to wait. I had opportunities along the way, but I knew that I needed to change as a person first. And then when I'd done it, not that I haven't done, there's still a lot of change that needs to happen. Don't get me wrong.
We all have work to do.
But when enough change had happened that I had a fighting chance, at a happy marriage, God brought this wonderful person into my life, and we met and married in 4 months to the day.
Oh, my.
It was that evident.
Oh.
Plus, when you're 48, you don't want to wait much longer, so let's do this, Debbie. And her best friend is married to one of my best friends, and we didn't know each other existed, and they connected us on the phone May 14th, 2013, and we got married on September 14th. 2013.
Oh, we were married on the 15th. It's a good, auspicious moment.
Yes, awesome. And then Riley came along in 2015 and Reagan in 2019. So our two little girls are now 9, soon to be 10, and 6, and both at Lake Forest Country Day School and loving it.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Michael.
Frank, thank you. You've had so many, it's made me say over 130 reflections and testimonials, arguably none more interesting and fulfilling as this one. Thank you. Question regarding Cuba, and have you been to Cuba, and what is the status of faith in that country? A quick background: I grew up in Yugoslavia, and most of Warsaw Pact was the Karl Marx theory of religion is opium for the masses. Poland probably is the only major exception, and thank for Pope John Paul, in actually many ways accelerated the demise of the USSR. But anyway, I'd love to get your perspective on status of faith and any hopes or any advice for any Cubans that may be watching this.
So my home church in Miami, in Coral Gables, has over the years sent delegations or supported delegations of groups of Christians to go and support and teach and train and help churches in Cuba. I think there is a pretty vibrant faith community in pockets, but it's hard. Not as hard, I don't think, as it is in China. Although there are more Christians in China than there are in the United States. And one could argue that it's not despite the persecution, but maybe because of the persecution. I don't think it's a coincidence that churches, if you look at the global landscape, that the church, the spirit seems to be blowing more strongly, and churches seem to be growing more vibrantly in places where Christians have it the hardest. Where life is easy, speaking of the opioid of the masses, I think it's the opioid of the comfortable. When life is easy, it's so easy to take your focus off of God and put them onto idols, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's work or family or organizations. Work is good, family is good, organization is good, but when you put them in the place of God, that's idolatry. And when life is comfortable, it's a lot easier to live in an idolatrous manner. When you don't have the comfort, when you're forced to make hard choices, when everything else has been stripped from you, all of a sudden God becomes a lot more visible. Well, he should have been a lot more visible regardless. And so I don't despair for the church in places like Cuba or China or whatever. In fact, I'm almost envious of them because they see reality, and for people who live comfortable lives, what they see often is an illusion. To answer your question, I've not been to Cuba proper. I've been.
Can you go there with your native background?
So. A couple things. My brother was also a Bush administration official. He was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida from 2002 to 2005. And during that time period, he indicted Cuban Air Force pilots and a general who 6 years earlier had shot down 2 U.S. civilian Cessnas over the Straits of Florida. And so my brother brought the indictment against these Cuban officials. So he's almost certainly not welcome to go to Cuba, to return to where he was born. As his brother and as the former chief of staff to the first Cuban-American cabinet secretary in history, I'm probably not, very welcome to go back. Despite all that, my brother can't go. Maybe I can. Before my dad passed, I actually had a conversation with my parents. Do you want to go back? Mm-hmm. It's been, 50 years. Do you want to go back? Do you want me to take you back to visit? And they said no. They have friends who have returned and come back so demoralized because the Cuba they remember no longer exists. So my parents wanted to remember the Cuba they had, and they didn't want to see what it had become. Mm-hmm. I've only been to Guantanamo twice as a private citizen in a lawsuit against the Clinton administration for detaining 35,000 Cuban rafters at Guantanamo in the mid-90s. And then I returned 5 times subsequently as a U.S. government official. So first 2 times I was suing the government, the next 5 times I was the government, but that's the only part of Cuba I visited.
We have time for one more question. Bob?
Let me add my voice to the choir. Thank you for sharing your extraordinary life story so far, which leads to 2 questions. One is all of us have, at least I think most of us have mentors, people who have huge significant influences on life and career, who may have been a mentor or two of yours that has been a profound impact on you? And secondly, what's next?
I'm going to say Jeb Bush. Best boss I ever had. Not maybe what you think of him. There was a time at the governor's mansion where his staff were administered the Myers-Briggs test. And all the extroverts were asked to go to one side of the room and all the introverts to another side of the room. And on this side of the room was almost everyone. And they were like dancing the conga line. And on this side of the room was like 3 people, the governor and 2 of his lawyers, not me. But, you know, he's different from his brother in that way. But he is the most loyal, the most principled. You know, he took positions as governor that were unpopular, and yet he left with record approval ratings. And invariably, you would talk to people, they would say, you know, I might not have agreed with him on this or that, but I respected him and I thought he was doing it for what he thought was the right reason and not for ulterior motives. And that was true. And everyone who's worked in government service knows alumni circles. Every elected official or cabinet secretary has, you know, an alumni circle of staff that have worked for them over the years. And I know a lot of these circles, and I don't know of a single circle other than Jeb Bush's circle where, to a person, all the alumni are loyal to that person, love that person, laud that person. I don't know of a single, and I know hundreds of them, I don't know of a single Jeb Bush staffer who doesn't to this day, you know, sing his praises. And he showed that loyalty directly to me. In my first year working for him, I sent him an email. That email was produced in a public records request. It ended up being printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the state. It became a bit of a scandal. It's about the judicial selection process. And the governor responded to that by promoting me to be the deputy chief of staff, from being the deputy general counsel, being deputy chief of staff. And that kind of loyalty is rare. And I can think of another time where I was going through a personal painful experience in a personal relationship, and he knew that I was distraught, and he invited me quietly to a lunch at the mansion, and then shared with me some of his personal relational struggles over the years. Just he had heard that I was going through this, and he went out of his way to open himself up and be vulnerable to me to give me support and encouragement. I could go on, but the answer is Jeb Bush. And then as far as what's next, you know, I'm blessed to work for a wonderful company, GE Healthcare, a medical equipment provider and pharmaceutical diagnostics provider. It's a spinoff from GE. We've been our own company now for 2 years. I love my boss, love my team, love the people, love the work. And as I mentioned earlier, we love this area. In my career, I've learned, you know, to take my hands off the wheel. I can't control, I can't predict, I can't plan. If coming out of high school 43 years ago, you had asked me to predict the course of my career and given me 1 million chances to try, I would have batted 0 for 1 million. It's just, so who knows? But I'm, you know, happy in the moment, happy with the way things are at present, and just grateful to a God who has made it all happen, often despite my best efforts to thwart him.
Praise be to God. I think we'll close now. Luke, will you close us?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. And what we always do at this point is ask for our daily bread. But today we're going to ask for God to activate the Holy Spirit's goods and services all across this world that make our daily bread possible. Let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.